This knife has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding like true crime videos. I discuss psychological experiments as well, a bit of everything, with a little bit of university and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm back discussing another one of my true stories that inspired horror films series. I've done a couple of these in the past and I've got loads because you guys seem to really enjoy them. So today I'm going to be talking about the true case that inspired the Scream films, which are kind of classic films. If you haven't really seen them, they're very, very classic in the horror film community. And there is a very, very interesting true story that inspired the serial killer in the Scream films. So if you want to hear a little bit about this case, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. So the story of the Scream films was ultimately inspired by a serial killer who actually hunted a bunch of students in Gainesville, Florida in 1990. The first victims of this serial killer were two young women. Their names were Sonia Larson, who was 18 years old, and Christina Powell, who was 17 years old. They were attacked in their own apartment on the 24th of August 1990. The attacker had broken into their apartment while the pair was still in there. He had bound both of the young girls and stabbed Larson to death first. During his attack on Larson, he left Powell downstairs, which is then when he returned to her and continued to attack her. He first sexually assaulted her, and then once this was over, he then proceeded to stab her multiple times in her back. Sadly, she died as a result, and the killer didn't stop there. He continued to completely mutilate the bodies before fleeing the scene. One really strange thing that you'll notice throughout this case is that the killer proceeded to pose the bodies of the victims that he had attacked before leaving wherever it was that he'd attacked them. So he posed them in a number of strange ways, and it just shows that he had actually taken the time to mutilate these bodies before he left. The following night after Sonia and Christina's death, the next attack occurred. This time the victim was a young woman named Christa Hoyt. Just like the previous victims, she had been bound, sexually assaulted, and then stabbed in the back and posed before the killer left. So when the first responders arrived on the scene, they actually discovered her decapitated head on top of her bookshelf. 2 days after Christa Hoyt's attack on August the 27th, 1990, a maintenance man entered the apartment of two young roommates after he'd been asked to check on them since no one had heard from them in a while. According to this maintenance man, he let himself into the apartment after no one answered, entered and then immediately left again, turned around, walked straight out and called the police because of what he had seen. The two roommates living in this apartment were the next victims of this killer, and their names were, I'm sorry if I mispronounce these, Manny Taboada and Tracy Paules. Manny had been just murdered on the spot, whereas Tracy's encounter was a lot similar to the previous woman that had been murdered. So she had been bound, sexually assaulted and then stabbed in the back. The maintenance worker, who had obviously found these bodies upon letting himself into the apartment, claimed that he'd seen Tracy's body first, and it was this sight that made him immediately exit and call the police. He claimed that when he'd seen this body, it had been lying by the door just on the ground. However, this changed at a later point, saying that she had been lying next to a black bag. However, this black bag was never found by any of the police investigators, so no one knew the relevance of this, whether it was moved or just whether it never existed. At this point, it became very clear to investigators and the public alike that they were dealing with a serial killer who was attacking young victims, and it was around this time that the media coined the term the Gainesville Ripper. Investigators' first suspect was a man named Edward Lee Humphrey. On August the 30th of that year, Humphrey was arrested for assaulting his 79-year-old grandmother, and upon his arrest, police became very, very enthusiastic, kind of wanted to paint the picture of him being the Gainesville Ripper. It was almost as though he seemed to fit the profile enough for them to spin this story, create this image of him potentially being the Gainesville Ripper. It started to appear as though they had been kind of scapegoating Humphrey, and there were these wild claims that they made that they apparently knew of different things around his crime or his criminal behaviours that just kind of helped their belief or helped them paint this image of him being the serial killer. So there were claims like when they arrested him for assaulting his grandmother, he was holding a knife, which he wasn't. They claimed that he allegedly stopped taking his medication for his bipolar disorder, which I'm sure if you already know, but if you don't know, bipolar disorder can lead to some quite highs and lows, extreme behaviours. So there are a lot of instances where people have kind of done seemingly psychotic things because of the lack of medication, but this also wasn't the case. They also claimed that his family had reported a number of times to the police that they were concerned about his whereabouts because he would just really randomly disappear for strange reasons, for strange amounts of time, and they just didn't know where he went. It appeared as though these claims were either falsified or even just exaggerated, as even after months of him being arrested, he was never charged with anything. And so because they had no real evidence, and it kind of just like trickled away that it didn't really seem like he was the right person to be held in custody, he was released, never arrested, and cleared his name. I'm really sorry if you can hear any noise outside. There's literally a man just sat outside my window playing bongos and singing, and it's extremely frustrating. A man named Danny Rowling was the next potential suspect in the investigation that police investigators seemed to sort of focus their attention on. Danny had a particularly rough childhood. He was the victim of quite a lot of abuse, and it led to him actually being an alcoholic by the time he was 11 years old. He enrolled in the Air Force at quite a young age, kind of the minimum age you can when you wanted to join the Air Force, but it was actually after leave, not long after joining, because he was diagnosed with quite a serious personality disorder. From this point on, things just seemed to go downhill for Danny, and his marriage failed and fell apart. He pretty much became a drifter. He would rob stores for petty things, just steal random little items, and it just seemed like he'd lost all direction in his life. He then came across the police's radar in May of 1990 when he shot his father twice. So his father ultimately did survive the attack, thankfully, but he lost sight in one eye and he lost an ear as well. He fled immediately after the attack on his father, but he was ultimately caught in September of that year when he tried to rob a grocery store in Florida and was ultimately recognised and arrested. During the pursuit of Rowling, there had been an incident where investigators spotted him, and there was a chase that ensued where they were following Rowling, and they ended up chasing him into this woodland area. So they seemed to follow him into this woodland area where he was heading. This area had a campsite in it, which is a really strange addition into discussing his involvement. Inside this campsite they found some really strange things. So they found blood-stained clothing, they had found cash with dye on them, obviously suggesting that he had stolen the cash. There was also some strange tapes that were played during Danny Rowling's trial. The tapes just show Danny discussing a bunch of topics. There were quite a few tapes. One just him addressing his brother, telling his brother the best way to hunt animals and how to gut them. And there was one also addressed directly to his dad, who he'd obviously attacked. And I have written here what he said in this tape. On this tape he said, "I hope you're doing better. I let you down. I'm sorry for that. Well, I've got to sign off for a bit. I've got something I've got to do. I love you. Bye." And the other tapes included Rowling's kind of explaining what he called his other personalities, and they actually had names. So he called them Enad and Gemini, and just sort of explaining the difference between them in his head. Obviously this links back to him being discharged from the Air Force for being diagnosed with a personality disorder. And there was also a tape full of just random songs that he'd allegedly written himself and him performing them to the camera. So there was a lot of strange things on these tapes. And this discovery of this campsite and all of these tapes was actually made the day after the murder of Manny and Tracy in their apartment. So Rowling was ultimately not only arrested for the attack on his father and the robberies that he'd carried out, but also on suspicion of all of the murders that had occurred in Florida in that year. And then a month before his trial, Rowlings allegedly confessed to his cell roommate, his name was Bobby Lewis, that he was the man known as the Gainesville Ripper, and that the charges that they were claiming he was on suspicion of were true. He allegedly told Lewis that he had carried out the murders, he was the one that did them, but he said he had not finished his mission. He claimed that he would kill another 8 people in the year, one representing each year of jail time that he'd served in his life. And because of all this coming out, Rowlings ultimately was found guilty of all of the murders, and he was sentenced to death penalty. And then in 2006, just before the date scheduled for his execution, he actually confessed to 3 murders that he claimed he'd committed in Louisiana in 1989, the year before the Gainesville Ripper was active. These alleged attacks that he'd carried out were on 55-year-old William Grissom, his daughter who was 24, her name was Julie Grissom, and then Julie's son Sean in their home while they were preparing for dinner. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding Rawlings while he was in prison. There was quite a lot of media coverage. There was a little bit of a scandal where he was allegedly engaged to a news reporter or a journalist. Her name was Sondra London, and she actually specialised in serial killers reporting on their crimes and things, which makes their union quite unsettling. And Rawlings' case was even more unsettling, even through to the point of his day of execution, when a witness who had been there for the execution claimed that he'd actually witnessed Rawlings singing one of his own songs to himself as he was being executed. So everything around that was extremely unsettling and strange. So Kevin Williamson was the man who wrote the Scream movies, and he said that his inspiration came directly from the Gainesville Ripper, as he'd heard of the case when he was a child or when he was quite young, and it kind of stuck with him ever since. The opening scene of the Scream movie was directly inspired by Williamson's own experience. He had been house sitting one night when he came across a story on the television of the Gainesville Ripper. As he hadn't been staying in his own home, the story made him feel really, really uneasy because he was in this unfamiliar place. And he said he immediately felt the need to search the entire house for any intruders. At this point he came across an open window and he couldn't remember opening it at all himself at any point in the night, so he headed straight for the kitchen, armed himself with a knife because he was sure that there was someone in the home. He grabbed the phone and called a friend just in case he did encounter an intruder, and obviously if you've ever seen the Scream films, this is pretty much exactly what happens in the opening scene, and it was inspired directly by Williamson's own experience. So that is everything I have to discuss today, kind of a short summary of the Gainesville Ripper and how this inspired the Scream films. I hope you found this interesting. Let me know any suggestions you have down below of cases you want me to discuss, or horror films or psychological experiments, as they're kind of what I specialise on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Bye!